to part 2 of this lecture on mass victimisation, where we're covering the genocide against the Tutsi people in Rwanda. And we're in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to take you through a bit of a timeline to how we get to the situation that there is a genocide that happened in Rwanda. So we've just talked through in part 1 a bit of the background of one of those mass victimisation events that related to Murambi. But one of the things that you might be wondering after we've defined this crime of genocide is, how does a country or an area get to a situation that it explodes into chaos and that hundreds of thousands, into even in some cases millions of people are targeted for extermination? Because that might sound like something to you that you think, well, how on earth can such a thing happen? How is it possible that you can, not that you can ever forgive it, but you can understand that crime in a general sense exists, victimisation in a general sense exists, and that people may be targeted on a one-off basis, whereby you have murders that happen, you have assaults that happen. But how can it be that a country is in a situation that people on such a mass basis, into those hundreds of thousands or millions, can be targeted based upon simply, in Rwanda's case, their ethnic identity? Well, to explain this, we need to go back and think about Rwanda and what Rwanda's history was. So Rwanda, if you were to go back to the mid to late 19th century, so the 1800s, before colonisation, so before it was colonised, and we'll come on to colonisation in a moment. So before it was colonised, the Rwandan people lived like any people live, and particularly like any people in Africa lived at the time. There were tribal groups, and in Africa there were tribal groups known as the Hutu, the Tutsi and the Twa. The Hutu, the Tutsi and the Twa. Now, we're not going to talk much about the Twa in this particular class. There is some technical discussion we could have about them if we had more time. But the reality is, related to 1994, the Twa's role was relatively minimal in what unfolded. The Twa were and are only about 1% of the country's population. They were a group that never had any sort of political power. They tended to be self-sufficient and live themselves in some of the forest regions and mountain regions of Rwanda, and didn't tend to interact too much in mainstream society, and so we don't really need to talk about them too much. What we do need to talk about is the other two groups, though, the Hutu and the Tutsi. So the Tutsi were the minority of the country, but a sizable minority. They were about 15% roughly of the population were Tutsi, and the Tutsi were also the monarchy of the country. So we had a Tutsi king and a Tutsi royal family that existed. But important for you to realise, in pre-colonial times, Hutu, Tutsi and Twa were not really thought about as being ethnic groups as such. They were really more a caste system or a class system. Now, to explain that, the 84% of the population, the large majority of the population, were the Hutu. And the Hutu were those that were the farmers, the agriculturalists, those that worked in the fields. Those were the ones that were classed as Hutu. Whereas the Tutsi were those that tended to be the likes of the farm owners, those that also owned the likes of livestock, such as cows, such as pigs, such as goats, the ones who had a bit more wealth. And if a Hutu, so someone that started off being relatively lowly working in the fields, if they managed to save and barter and work their way up in some way, then let's say that they were able to acquire and own 10 cows, then they could be reclassified as being a Tutsi. So there was effectively a rudimentary or crude form of social mobility that existed, so that although the majority of the country were Hutu and were, poor, but in the grand scheme of things, they were able to work their way out of that situation and climb the social ladder in some way. But this is no different really to any other society even that exists today. If you were to look at, let's say, the political elites or the wealthy of any country around the world today, it's always a minority of that country that harbours the most wealth. This is not by any means an unusual circumstance. So the sort of breakdown we're talking about here of, 15% of the population being the most wealthy and 84% being somewhat poorer. That's really no different to what we see even today in the UK. So this was not an unusual set of circumstances. But again, to be clear, the Hutu and Tutsi were a caste system. They were not an ethnic group. They were not ethnicities or race groups as such. But we fast forward to the late part of the 19th century, and as much of the Western world did with Africa, they came in and took over parts of Africa, and it was the Germans that initially came in and colonised Rwanda and took over as colonial administrators. Now, they didn't depose the monarchy at that point, the Germans. Instead, what they did was they completely maintained the monarchy as it was, recognising that the monarchy provided some stability within the country. And they favoured the Tutsi as continuing to rule the country. So you had the colonial administrators, but the day-to-day running of the country was still carried out then by the Tutsi. In the aftermath of World War I, when Germany lost World War I, as many of you may know, their abroad territories were removed as part of reparation and given to other countries to then rule. And it was Belgium that then took over in the aftermath of World War I. They took over the colonial administration of Rwanda. And it was at this time that there was somewhat of a fatal mistake, as it later turned out to be, whereby the later phases of the Germans and then carried on by the Belgians, they effectively looked at these categorizations that they knew existed in Rwanda of Hutu and Tutsi. But they sort of misunderstood what Hutu and Tutsi were, and they recategorized Hutu and Tutsi as ethnic identities. They technically referred to them as ethnicities. So individuals that then lived in the country, citizens, were then issued with new identification cards, which signalled on them, in the same way that a passport might, it signalled on them what someone's ethnic identity was. So it had on it basically lines here where it said Hutu, Tutsi and Twa, and then two of those were crossed out, and the remaining ethnic identity was left the one to show the member of the ethnic group that that individual belonged to. Now this then became a problem, because with bringing in ethnicity to the equation, this then stopped Hutu, Tutsi and Twa as being a class group or a caste group, and being categorized then as a Hutu then meant that individual was always a Hutu. There was no way of social mobility. There was no way of a Hutu becoming a Tutsi. Now, how we know that the notion of ethnic identity here was also somewhat of a nonsense, as well as the fact that we know that it used to be a caste system, as well as that, a child that was born to, let's say, a mixed marriage, as it would have been referred to. So let's say you had a Hutu husband and a Tutsi wife. If they then had children, here's the problem. There was no ethnic group that was a mixed group as such. That child had to then become ethnically identified as being either a Hutu or a Tutsi. And the child's ethnic identity followed the bloodline of the father. So if you had, let's say, a Hutu husband, Tutsi wife, and they had a child, that child would be a Hutu because their father was a Hutu. But let's reverse the roles. Let's say we had a Tutsi husband and a Hutu wife. If they had a child, then that child would be categorized as Tutsi because they've got a Tutsi father. So in both situations, you've got a child that is exactly 50-50 Hutu-Tutsi, but yet they're then ethnically identified as being 100% the ethnic identity that their father was. And this is how we know, as you'll now detect, that the whole ethnic system in Rwanda was, I don't think I can say this politely, so I apologise for the language here, but it was bullshit. It was bullshit. It always was bullshit. There was never any ethnic groups in Rwanda in that way. They were labelled as being ethnic groups. They were labelled as being an ethnic identity. But of course, the problem then was that as the colonial administrators continued to prefer the Tutsi over the Hutu, this then meant that the Hutu were effectively held back in such a way that they could never socially progress. They were always going to remain poor, and that was it. So you can imagine the mentality that was then running through a lot of the majority of the country at the time, the Hutu, who felt like they were being victimized, even if not direct, they were being indirectly victimized because they saw the colonists, the wealthy colonists coming in, they saw them preferring the minority and maintaining the power the minority had without any possible intrusion from the majority of the population. And so you can imagine there was areas of resentment building up. And as any country does, it goes to any country whereby there's tropical climates happens. There were things like droughts, there were things like floods, and of course the groups that were most affected by that were of course the Hutu. So it was the Hutu that would have been starving, it was the Hutu that would have been killed in certain situations. And so in reality at that stage, very much you can argue that the Hutu were victims at that point. And I've actually got a book in my office that is titled When Victims Become Killers, which refers to the victims that the Hutu were at one stage and how later this then flipped round and they became killers. So at that stage, the Hutu were very much victims, and eventually tensions boiled over, and there were periods of time in the early to mid part of the 20th century whereby there were actually uprisings, there were Hutu uprisings that took place, whereby there was violence perpetrated by the Hutu against the Tutsi out of frustration and resentment and wanting a foothold into the power that was held solely by the Tutsi through the colonizing influence. As the situation got worse and we get towards the late 1950s, into the early 1960s, but the late 1950s, the situation became terminal, we could say, through the 1950s, whereby arguably the colonists realised that they were fighting a losing battle here, that they were undergoing these periods of perpetual violence, that they weren't going to be able to withhold this for too much longer. And then the event happened that the Tutsi king died, and the new king that then came in for a short period of time didn't kind of have the same influence and actually also died unexpectedly himself. And this left somewhat of a vacuum, which made it an ideal time for the colonizers, some would say to save their own skin, then decided to switch allegiance. And this then became a problem, because in switching allegiance, this then led on to the situation whereby you had then the large majority that then moved into positions of power. Then the large majority harboured a grudge against the minority group, the Tutsi. So the Hutu were able then finally to get into a position of power, and they harboured resentment against the Tutsi, who they believed had targeted them. The reality was that it was the colonising influence that had created the victimisation of the Hutu group. It wasn't the Tutsi themselves at all, it was the colonising influence. But of course the majority population didn't understand the politics of colonisation and weren't aware of that. They just saw that their situation had become much worse, that they had lost friends and family members through drought and famine, etc. Whilst at the same time the Tutsi elite were living a very comfortable lifestyle. And so the Tutsi were deposed of any positions of power. And then in the late 1950s into the early 60s, there was a situation whereby there was a referendum that was held, a vote that was held to declare independence for Rwanda, which passed. And in the early 1960s, Rwanda became independent. And this is then what became really problematic for the Tutsi, because becoming an independent nation then meant the colonising influence was then gone. So the Tutsi no longer had any protection from the international community for the potential victimisation that they may suffer. And so throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, there were sporadic massacres of Tutsi that took place by the Hutu. And there was somewhat of an impunity that was created whereby there was no punishment for those that perpetrated that violence against the minority group. As the Hutu politicians that became in charge of Rwanda First of all, an individual named Gregoire Kayibanda, and then later, as we'll come on to, the president that ruled for 21 years, Juvenal Habyarimana. And through both of their reigns, the situation became dire for the Tutsi, because there then came segregation in the classroom, whereby Hutu children and Tutsi children were separated. The Tutsi children were given second-class education and not given access to resources in a number of areas. There was then separation and segregation in the workplace between Hutu and Tutsi, and again, Tutsi found it very difficult to get jobs. And then eventually, a bit like how ghettos were created in World War II for Jewish communities, there were certain areas of the country whereby Tutsi were then sent to live. So there was then effectively villages and towns that were effectively only for the Tutsi, and it was not those villages and towns that were particularly well off, and they were all sent to live there. Now that became a problem because later on what it also meant was that when they were being targeted for extermination later, the Hutu knew exactly what areas to go to that were a high concentration of Tutsi people. So Kayibanda was, as the president, was deposed through a military coup in 1973 by Juvenal Habyarimana, who had been in charge of the armed forces. So Major Juvenal Habyarimana, who was in charge of the armed forces of Rwanda under Kayibanda's rule. And he actually lived in a slightly smaller house that was within the presidential compound. So it was very easy for him to get access to the president's home. And so there was a military coup whereby Habyarimana and some of his troops deposed Kayibanda, and President Juvenal Habyarimana was the one who would go on to rule Rwanda for the next 21 years, from 1973 until 1994. Now, during that 21 years, Habyarimana then ramped up propaganda against the Tutsi. So, believing that he could basically be in power forevermore, if he became a figure and an image of strength amongst the Hutu majority, it would then be very easy, because any elections that took place, which were then basically voting based upon ethnic grounds, of course, if he was seen to be a strong Hutu leader, he could very easily get large proportions of any vote, which might create an illusion of democracy within the country, but in reality any vote that took place was a fait accompli, that he was able to be voted in time and time again with no real opposition. And so Habyarimana realised that if he was able to use this narrative that the Tutsi once demonised us, they're your enemy, we can take revenge against them and make sure the Hutu are strong, the Hutu have power now, you'll always have power as a Hutu with me as your president. This was the sort of narrative that was then created, and the narrative itself then was the Hutu power movement. So Hutu power, power for the Hutu. This was a movement that was created under Juvenal Habyarimana's presidency. So over that 21 years that he was in charge of the country, there was propaganda that was perpetuated through media publications, through newspapers, through magazines. There's a magazine called Kangura, which was a bit like a combination between Private Eye and Viz, if you know those two publications, whereby sometimes there was cartoons that poked fun at the Tutsi, but other times it was very dehumanizing images that were shown. So showing the Tutsi to be rats, let's say, the Tutsi in rat form, showing the Tutsi to be cockroaches, Inyensi as the term in Kinyarwanda, the language of Rwanda, is termed. So there was this period for 2 decades of dehumanizing, mocking and blaming the Tutsi. And so, over that 21 years, you can imagine if you were a child that was, let's say, 2 years old at the point that Habyarimana came in and was in charge of the country, by the time you're 21, 22, 23, you are now an adult, and all you have known for your entire life is that the Tutsi are the enemy, that in school the Tutsi are second class and not as good, through publications that you see in the media and hear on the radio, such as the RTLM radio station, that the Tutsi are indeed not even human, that they are people that you're suspicious of, you should be fearful of. These are people that targeted and victimised your parents and your grandparents, that you shouldn't trust them, and that violence against those people is effectively okay. These are the messages that young people then grew up, even into their early 20s, their entire life, all they knew. In other words, they'd been brainwashed. They'd been conditioned to hate the Tutsi. And so this is how the conditions can be created, whereby down the line, there's a boiling pot of hatred that's been built up amongst the majority of the population. A boiling pot of everybody believing that this minority are the enemy, this minority caused you and your ancestors damage, that if the situation arises, it's fine to be violent against that group. This is the boiling pot whereby millions of people, millions and millions of people, believe that this is not only okay, but that it's actually the morally right thing to do, to always be suspicious of that group, and that if you see signs of that group trying to get any sort of power or any sort of say, then they should be held back from being able to do that because they might try and take over again. This went on again for 21 years under Habyarimana's reign, and a number of those Tutsi that had fled the country under the previous massacres that we mentioned, so through the 1950s and 1960s, and then again into the 1970s and 80s, when there were some sporadic massacres of Tutsi that had happened, including in some cases we're talking about tens of thousands. We're not talking about just small numbers, we're talking about tens of thousands of Tutsi being massacred. During that period of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a number of Tutsi families fled the country in fear of their lives. So they fled, thousands and thousands fled, particularly into Uganda in the north, also into the Zaire, as it was now the Democratic Republic of Congo in the west, and that they had been living in some cases for now a couple of decades there by the time that we get to the late 80s into early 90s. And some of those Tutsi that had fled had left everything behind, because it might have been that their neighbours were being targeted, they knew they were next, they fled, they left their home, they left everything behind and fled. And so almost naturally, you can imagine, at some point, those individuals or groups might want to come back to their homes. But anytime Tutsi tried to come back into the country, in many cases they would have been killed, in other cases they would have been imprisoned, all sorts of issues. They were persecuted, effectively. And those Tutsi that had fled into Uganda in the north had been being supported by the Ugandan authorities at the time. Indeed, many had actually entered the Ugandan armed forces. And as members of that armed forces, they formed their own groups as well, as being diaspora of Rwanda, Rwandese nationals that were living in exile, effectively. And so a number of these individuals had significant military training. And this went on, of course, throughout the 1970s and 80s. By the time we get to 1990, we've then got significant groups of the population that were trained militarily, and they formed a group known as the RPF, the Rwandese Patriotic Front, a political group that they formed in Uganda. They formed this group in the 1980s, and this went into the early 1990s. And as part of that group, they also had a military wing called the RPA, so the Rwandan Patriotic Army. And at some point, when that group had all been militarily trained and they'd been supported, the group, the RPA, then decided that the time was now right to basically go in and try and get back their homes, their property, which was theirs. This is the thing, it was theirs. This wasn't as has been categorised by some media outlets. It wasn't, you'll see the term invasion used. They talk about the RPA invading the country. That is such a shallow and naive understanding of the situation. It's ridiculous. It shows no understanding of the history of those people. The fact that these are people that actually were Rwandese nationals who had previously lived in Rwanda, or indeed were the children, because they may have been children at the time that their parents fled into exile. They may have grown up in Uganda, but they were Rwandese nationals, and their parents had homes that should then be passed on to the children. So this group decided they wanted to go back, but of course the Rwandan army that existed at that time, the FAR, which was Rwandan Armed Forces at that time, were then sent to try and combat the RPA as they were advancing in the north of the country. And so what ensued for the next couple of years, between 1990 and 1993, was effectively a civil war. You had the RPA, the former diaspora, wanting to come back to Rwanda on one hand, and you had the Rwandese armed forces on the other hand, who were then fighting against each other they were trying to stop the RPA coming back into the country. And so in the north of Rwanda in particular, this civil war raged on for a couple of years before the United Nations then got involved, realising there was somewhat of an impasse and this civil war was going nowhere, and recognising the history of the country, unlike again some of the particularly poor commentators on the situation that don't understand the history. The United Nations at the very least did understand the history here and the complexities of the history that existed. And so the UN set up in Tanzania, so again that country to the east of Rwanda, they set up and brokered some peace talks, and these became known as the Arusha Accords. Arusha being the capital in Tanzania, so Arusha, the Arusha Accords. So the leaders of the MRND government, which was Juvenal Habyarimana and his senior political figures, and the senior figures of the RPF, who were at that time based in Uganda, were invited to come to Arusha and talk over, how can we broker a ceasefire to stop the civil war, and how can we prevent this situation escalating again in the future. And there was an agreement that was made, that was led by the United Nations, to broker a new power-sharing government in Rwanda, which should be equally composed of members of the current MRND government, so Juvenal Habyarimana's government, and also an equal number of senior officials from the RPA, as it stood, the RPF, the Rwandese Patriotic Front, so that a power-sharing government could be created, which would allow for both groups to be protected. It would allow for the Hutu to be protected as the majority. It would allow for the Tutsi to be protected in country, and for those that were living in exile to come back to the country as well. So this was supposed to be the plan. And Habyarimana signed the peace accords in late 1993, as it was. Late 1993, the peace accords were actually signed and agreed. Now, this then becomes a problem if you think about the situation, because Habyarimana had spent 2 decades solidifying himself as being a person of strength who backed up the Hutu majority, who was never going to, on his watch, allow the Tutsi to get any sort of power. And the majority of the population had been conditioned and brainwashed into then believing this. So you can perhaps imagine that Hutu majority's mindset when they learned all of a sudden that through the international community involvement that Habyarimana had now all of a sudden agreed to share power with the Tutsi. In the eyes of the hardline Hutu extremist who had been brainwashed, the Tutsi were the enemy. They would not be able to believe that their beloved leader, Juvenal Habyarimana, would now agree to share power with them, share power with the enemy who are not to be trusted. Some of those, hardline, brainwashed, conditioned individuals may well then have believed, Habyarimana has become weak. We can't have him continuing to be our leader. We still need someone strong. We can't allow the Tutsi to come in because they might take over again. So this is the situation that was then created. Habyarimana had basically created the condition for his own downfall. So we fast forward to early 1994. There were deadlines that were put in place in late 1993 for the end of that year, where the power-sharing government was supposed to be implemented. And those deadlines passed, and Habyarimana did not allow the safe passage of the RPF to come to Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, in order to put this in place. So the deadline passed. The UN set another deadline in early 94. That deadline also passed, with Habyarimana not budging. And so there was 3 or 4 deadlines in actual fact that passed with nothing happening. All the time you can imagine pressure by the UN is ramping up on Habyarimana. In the meantime, the country's in a bit of limbo, wondering what's going to be happening in terms of its governance. And you've got a large, sizable population amongst the population believing that Habyarimana has become weak. So fast forward to April the 6th, 1994. Juvenal Habyarimana is on an aeroplane, along with the president of Burundi, actually, flying back into Rwanda on his private aeroplane. And a rocket is launched from the ground in Rwanda and hits Habyarimana's plane, which then crashes. And by chance, Habyarimana's presidential compound was actually on the flight path, and his plane actually crashed basically in his own back garden. And the crash killed everybody on board. So Habyarimana, as the president, was killed. He was no more. And this is then when the country of Rwanda descended into chaos. So the plane crashed, the president was dead. To this day, nobody knows who actually fired that rocket. That's never been proven, who fired the rocket. There are some that theorise that perhaps it was some of those Hutu extremists who believed the president had become weak, that he needed to be removed, that someone strong needed to be put in place, because otherwise the Hutu might be in trouble again. So there's some that surmise that it was a group of Hutu hardline extremists that shot their own president down. There's other theories that say that maybe some of the RPF, the Tutsi, who by this point some of whom were in Kigali, there was some that said that perhaps as part of breaching the ceasefire that had been agreed for the civil war, that maybe they had breached the ceasefire and they had shot down the president. In reality, we'll almost certainly never know now, because what then unfolded for the next 3 months in Rwanda destroyed any possibility of getting forensic evidence. As it happens, the most recent examination of the evidence there tends to suggest it was likely the Hutu hardline extremist theory, because of looking at the trajectory of the rocket and the type of rocket that was fired. Where it would likely have to have been fired from would have been somewhere in what's called the Kanombe Hills, which was effectively the Rwandan Armed Forces military barracks. And there is some evidence of an order, a consignment of those particular missiles being brought in to the army barracks in the lead up to April the 6th, 1994. So that's the currently most likely scenario, but we'll never know for sure. All we know is that somebody shot down that plane and Habyarimana was killed. And this was then the excuse that was then needed to allow the killing to begin. So, all of a sudden, radio stations, the RTLM in particular in Rwanda, started broadcasting, saying, "Our president has been killed, it's terrible, he has been shot down by the Tutsi and killed, our beloved leader of the Hutu is gone, is no more, the Tutsi did this, the Tutsi must pay for their actions." This is the sort of radio broadcasts that were happening. Now here's the next problem with some of the academic commentary that you might see. There are some academic commentators that mischaracterize the genocide and say that because the president was shot down, this caused a genocide. This was arguably the trigger that allowed the genocide to start, but that is not what caused the genocide. What caused the genocide was the decades of persecution, the decades of suspicion and propaganda against the Tutsi that had instilled within the entire Hutu population this fear of the other, this fear of the Tutsi, suspicion of the Tutsi, and hatred of the Tutsi. And the reality is that a genocide had been being planned for some time in Rwanda by the Hutu, and including by the MRND government, the ruling government at the time. This had been planned and prepared for a long time. And this can be shown by going back to months before Habyarimana was killed. We had, because of the UN talks that were going on, there was a small UN peacekeeping operation that was in Rwanda by this point, and it was present throughout 1993 and into 1994, and it was supposed to be there to provide safe passage, to provide protection to the RPF coming from Uganda into the capital, into Kigali. So the UN peacekeeping operation was supposed to be to keep them safe while the new government was being set up, to ensure that where they were living was safe and they were guarded and all of these sorts of things. So the UN peacekeepers weren't there for anything to do with the wider population. They were there for the political purpose of protecting those involved in the peace talks and in the creating this new government. But in any case, the individual that was in charge of that UN peacekeeping operation was called General Romeo Dallaire. So Romeo Dallaire, he was Canadian, and he was in charge of the UN peacekeeping operation, Romeo Dallaire. He actually has a very good autobiography called Shaking Hands with the Devil. So you might want to get hold of that and have a read about it. Now, Dallaire discovered in late 1993 communications between high-ranking officials from the MRND government and also high-ranking traders within the Hutu population. And he discovered that there was large consignments of weapons that were being shipped in from China to Rwanda, large consignments of machetes and clubs, and also guns and other weapons that were being transported in. And he made official, on their own record, he made official communications to the UN headquarters to say that he was extremely concerned, that he'd learned that there was something big on the horizon that was going to happen, that he had learned about these weapons being brought in and where they were being brought in to. Now, Dallaire had a number of confidential informants that were warning him, basically, that there was a genocide on the horizon. They were warning him that there was something big that was coming. And there was a number of radio communications that indicated this was likely going to be a genocide. Now, Dallaire sought to try and get support from the United Nations to have their mandate extended. So their mandate was to protect these political individuals, remember. But Dallaire asked for that mandate to be extended to also include peacekeeping of the nation and to give him permission to go into where he knew these weapons were being transported and confiscate the weapons on the basis of the intelligence that he had. But again, somewhat fatally, as the chain of events would unfold, the UN denied that request. They denied the ability to extend the mandate. They said that they didn't have more peacekeepers to spare, so they couldn't extend the mandate, and that they should continue just to do their job in protecting the political figures. And so Dallaire was denied the opportunity to go in and seize these weapons that had been brought in. And again, this was some months before the genocide actually unfolded. And this is why we know this was a planned and prepared exercise. And it wasn't just that people started killing because the president was killed. Indeed, you can further rebut this because immediately upon the president being killed, Habyarimana being killed, the radio stations, as part of their broadcast, had started reading out lists of names. Now, you can probably imagine who these lists of names were. It was lists that the radio stations had already been given of Tutsi individuals who initially they were targeting the Tutsi individuals that had any sort of power or wealth or any sort of influence. So the sort of the key Tutsi figures. The names were being read out as targets for who the Hutu should go to and kill. And those lists continued being read out on the radio, including ordinary people. Basically, here are Tutsi that live at this address, they are to be killed. So these basically death lists were being read out on the radio for people to go and target. And so these lists had obviously been very well prepared in advance of what happened on April the 6th, 1994. And so there's clear evidence that this was not simply a sporadic event. Yes, there was a trigger in the president being shot down, but all of these events had been very carefully planned. And so the mass victimization was now underway. The almost indirect victimization through the social circumstances of segregation had been ongoing for decades, but it was now time for the direct mass victimization to begin. So the next morning, we get to April the 7th, 1994, and the Prime Minister, Agatha Uwilingiyimana, try and say that after a couple of pints, Agatha Uwilingiyimana, she was the Prime Minister who would have been next in charge with Habyarimana being killed, but she was known to be sympathetic to the Tutsi issue and supportive of the power-sharing government. So effectively, she had to be removed. Now remember, as we've just said, that the UN peacekeepers that were there to protect political figures like this. And so a short distance from Agatha Uwilingiyimana, the Prime Minister's home, there was a UN peacekeepers barracks which had a small number of Belgian peacekeepers. And several hundred Interahamwe or Hutu militia advanced upon that UN peacekeepers barracks on the morning of April the 7th, and they effectively said to the peacekeepers there, look, we're going to go and kill the Prime Minister. You've got two choices. You can fight us and we'll kill you, and that would be inevitable because no matter how many weapons this small band, because it was less than 20 peacekeepers, the small, no matter what weapons they had, there was hundreds of Interahamwe here. So they were told, you either fight us and we'll kill you, or You can lay down your weapons, and we will give you safe passage to the airport, and you can leave Rwanda. But either way, we are going to kill the Prime Minister. Not really being too sure what to do, the peacekeepers did have a very brief amount of time to discuss what they were going to do, and they sort of said they were going to lay down their weapons, but they knew that the situation was dire here, because they actually had concealed a few other weapons as well. And it became painfully clear that no matter what they were going to do, they were going to be killed anyway, these peacekeepers. So again, I've got some photos here of the peacekeeping barracks, which I've been to multiple times. I've been here several times. And you can see on the outer wall here a combination of bullet holes and grenade marks as well. So the peacekeepers managed to retreat into the barracks building, the main barracks building that was here, and they managed to hold out for a short amount of time before eventually were overrun and they were all killed. And this is now also another one of these small memorial buildings that is to the victims, the UN Belgian peacekeeping victims that are there. And as you'll be able to see in the picture, there's a stone pillar that represents each of the peacekeepers, and there's a small plaque that identifies which of the peacekeepers, which of the individuals that each pillar represents. On each of those pillars there's a notch that represents a year, each year of the life of that peacekeeper. Most of them were in their 20s and 30s at the time. So they were killed, and then shortly thereafter the Interahamwe advanced onto Habyarimana's home, and indeed they killed her, although her children managed to escape, but they killed her on the spot. So this effectively meant there was now all of a sudden a complete power vacuum in Rwanda, that there was no one sympathetic to the Tutsi protection cause anymore that could stand in the genocidaires' way. And so this then meant that over the period of the next 100 days, there was systematic targeting and killing of any Tutsi that could be found within the country. Only a few days later, we get to one of those regions that I was talking about earlier on, whereby almost exclusively the people that lived there were Tutsi, which was maybe about 30 miles roughly outside of Kigali, outside of the capital city. And there was an area, there were a couple of villages close to each other that were almost solely populated by Tutsi. And in each of those areas, the Rwandan people were and are mainly Christian, and very religious, and most attended churches. And so if we go to these two areas, one's called Narama, and the other one's called Nyamata. So on the dates between the 10th and the 12th of April 1994, so going onwards of a few days after this genocide began, after these massacres began, whereby Tutsi were being targeted, as soon as many as possible of the Tutsi in Kigali, the capital city itself, had been massacred, the Interahamwe and the other ordinary Hutu people began advancing out of Kigali into the neighbouring regions, and they knew that a good hunting ground for them would be to go to Narama and Nyamata, which were close by, and they're both only a couple of miles apart. And as the people living, the Tutsi living in Narama and Nyamata had heard what was happening, a number of them fled to their local churches, the church in Narama and the church in Nyamata. And let's say the church in Narama, it had the main church building, it also had outbuildings, including a Sunday school building, etc. And people fled to there. They fled in some cases taking a suitcase with belongings, not knowing how long they would be there for, believing, first of all, that the church would protect them, and second of all, that no matter how evil any killers may be, they wouldn't dare go into a church building and carry out murders and massacres there. Sadly, that was not to be the case, though, as in many cases, those in charge of the churches, the ministers and priests, betrayed the Tutsi, and in many cases quite happily opened the doors to the Hutu to come in and carry on the killing. And so at Narama and at Nyamata, in each of those locations, we're talking about between 5 and 10,000 Tutsi were massacred, either in the churches themselves or in the area and outer buildings and gardens surrounding the churches. In each of those locations, there were handfuls of survivors, but between 5 and 10,000 Tutsi were massacred in those locations. And again, each of those buildings now, Narama Church and Nyamata Church, are now permanent memorials. They're no longer active churches. They're now permanent memorials to the victims, the mass victims and mass victimization that took place on those grounds. So again, I've taken students here, I took students here actually in February 2020, and I think those that visited there would probably tell you that this was not a pleasant place to go and see, a very necessary set of places to go and see, but not perhaps the most enjoyable of places to go and see, if you could say that. These buildings are now in the process of transitioning to being protected by UNESCO, so being given World Heritage Site status. They're not quite there yet, but they're in the process of doing that. And as such, to avoid the buildings, degrading, as we've talked about in other subjects earlier on, there's some large structures that have been created to try and protect those buildings, to ensure that they can remain there for hopefully for eternity, but for as long as is physically possible, so that people can actually go and visit these places and see what's happened there. Now, in each of those areas, as well as then being a memorial in that museum sense, there's also mass graves that are there. And by mass graves, we're not talking about the bodies being dumped in the same way that happened at Murambi. We're talking here about purpose-built mass graves, so that these are bodies and remains that are in coffins, that have been given a decent burial, that there's been services for, and anybody from that local area, so not even just within the church grounds, but anybody, let's say, from within the area of Narama or the area of Nyamata, bodies of relatives could have been brought from the places they were massacred, in the streets and in the homes. They could be brought to these churches and be buried as victims of the genocide against the Tutsi. They could be buried in the mass graves there. So there's thousands, tens of thousands of bodies in the mass purpose-built graves there. And in actual fact, you can, as part of the visit to these areas, actually go down into the crypt, as it were, where the mass graves are, where the bodies are all held. And again, some students have been down there with me, and it's I think you could say somewhat of an emotional experience to go down and experience that for yourself. But this is the sort of victimization that we are really talking about that has happened there. The final thing to mention in this part of the lecture, and I think we might finish things up for this week at this point, is that there are also some purpose-built memorials. So not every memorial that exists in Rwanda related to the mass victims of the genocide against the Tutsi, not every memorial is what was a killing site. So we've talked about so far Murambi, we've talked about Narama Church and Nyamata Church. Those were actual killing sites. But of course, if you look, let's say, at the capital of Rwanda, Kigali, or Chigali as it's pronounced in Kinyarwanda, because the K is pronounced Chi. So if you were to look at Kigali itself being the capital city, you can imagine the amount of death that took place in the capital city, and that there was no one location where that happened. It was all over the city. And so a purpose-built memorial was created, Kigali Genocide Memorial, or Gisozi, because that's the area of Kigali it's within, the suburb of Kigali. Gisozi Genocide Memorial was built and created, and it was created purposefully with a huge amount of area set aside to have purpose-built mass graves that would allow anybody who had who found a victim. So again, there could be victims that were very obvious, that were killed in their homes or killed in the streets, but there was also others that were thrown into things like latrine pits, or thrown into rivers, or thrown into other makeshift mass graves, shallow graves, let's say, in gardens. Any bodies that were discovered in Kigali or the surrounding area could then be brought to this central memorial site and be given again a decent burial within the mass burial sites, the mass graves that exist there. And in many cases that was very necessary, because particularly if you had, let's say, an entire family that was massacred. So if you had an entire family, let's say, of, mother, father, 4 children, let's say, and aunts and uncles could have been killed too, then there would be no one to actually provide a normal burial. So that it's not like there was someone that was going to be able to get a plot at a local cemetery and bury them there. So in many cases, there was no possibility for that to happen, and so a great many bodies, whereby there was no known relatives, had to be brought somewhere to be buried and given a respected and respectful burial. And so many of those were brought to Kigali or Gisozi Genocide Memorial, as it's called. And at present, there's slightly over 250,000 Tutsi victims that are buried there. There's always one, most of the mass graves, when they're full, are then cemented over there. But there's always one that is kept open, because to this day, and you can look online at news reports, to this day, there are still bodies being found. As there's construction, let's say, for new property being built somewhere, occasionally they uncover, a mass grave containing, 100 victims or 200 victims. This is still going on. Even this year in 2020, there have been some smaller mass graves discovered. And so one of the mass graves at the memorial site is kept open to allow for new bodies, new victims, to be brought and be accorded a proper, respected burial. And if the bodies can be identified, so let's say they still have clothing and an identity card on them or something like that, if they can be identified, then their name is added to the wall of remembrance that exists at the Kigali Genocide Memorial, so that they can be remembered. So again, just short, slightly more than 250,000 bodies there. And again, if you go to the memorial site, then you can pay your respects at those graves. You can lay flowers and wreaths down for the victims, and you can go down to the garden of remembrance that exists there and take a bit of time to try and take in everything that you see there. So that's going to finish us up for this part of the lecture on mass victimization and genocide. So we've been talking so far today a lot about the history of how does a country get to the situation that there's such a level of mass victimization that hundreds of thousands, potentially over 1 million people have been massacred, and we've just talked through how that can happen. The level of victimization that we're talking about is quite often off the scale of what your mind can really take in, and there's some brutal realities of that that we've talked about. So we're going to talk next week a little bit more about what happens thereafter. How does a country deal with a situation whereby there has been such mass victimization that by its nature there's also a huge amount of perpetrators? So you've got victims, but you've also got victim survivors, large numbers of victim survivors that deserve to see justice being done. You've got huge numbers of perpetrator groups to be tracked down, to be tried. How does that all unfold? When we think about the aftermath of something like a genocide, months or years after that's finished, what sort of victim-offender relationship can possibly exist thereafter? So these are all the issues we're going to be talking about next week related to mass victimization using the case study of the genocide against the Tutsis. So hopefully you've found that to be informative, hopefully you've taken that all in, and hopefully you continue to be engaged, and we'll see where this continues to go next week. So thanks again for now. I'll see you all again later.